Thank you so much.
Yes, yes. So for some of you who might not be familiar with it, the Sea Life Center started back in 1998. Well, it opened back in 1998, but there's definitely been wildlife research and rehabilitation in the area before that. And our mission is to better understand the Alaskan ecosystem. And what's really cool about our facility is that we do research, rehabilitation, and education. So our goals are definitely to rescue and rehabilitate marine mammals. And the hope is to release back into the ocean whenever possible. But while we have the animals with us, we're learning about them, their ecology, their biology, as well as some of the unique behaviors they have. The Sea Life Center is also a hub for people to come in and learn about these animals. In the summertime, we have up to 30 interns in various departments throughout the Sea Life Center, as well as volunteers. We have visiting scientists. So there's just a lot of things that come through the Sea Life Center that help with different projects. And so it's pretty cool with that. And then the Sea Life Center is also a public aquarium. And so some of the animals that we have projects going with, people can see. But with the rehab animals, because of the permits we have, they are off-site, but we do have pictures and stuff like that we can show it for you. So like I said, the Sea Life Center opened in 1998. A lot of people think that the oil companies pay for us, but actually, yes, the Sea Life Center was built as a result of some of the monies that came from the Exxon Valdez oil spill, but it doesn't necessarily help maintain its day-to-day projects. So through the way the Sea Life Center was built was not only money from the oil spill, but also state and city support. And of course, we can't survive without donations. And like I said before, we are a public aquarium, but we also are doing research projects and of course, rehabilitation stuff too. Now, we wouldn't be able to do this stuff if we didn't have this government oversight. For the seals, they are over, the folks that work with us on that is the NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service. And so it's seals and whales that help us with that. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service are the group that oversee walrus, sea otters, as well as migratory birds. And so we have to have all these permits in good order for us to be able to function. But even more importantly, we wouldn't be able to function if it wasn't for the community support throughout Alaska. These are just the agreement holders that share territories through NOAA, the National Marine Fisheries Service. So if we get a call about an animal in a certain region, we notify the stranding agreement holder to see if they can help observe the animal and help us determine whether the animal should be sent to the Sea Life Center for rehabilitation. So over the 20 years we've been open, we've pretty much seen every type of live animal that's small enough to come to the Sea Life Center. And also, we deal with dead responses as well, especially whales. With our location, we work a lot with any Cook Inlet beluga strandings. And so through that information, we're trying to assess what's going on with wildlife through the animals that come in and are rehabilitated with us, as well as animals that might become deceased. The way that works is we have a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week hotline. As a matter of fact, sitting right next to me is our rehab cell phone. So if we get a call during that, I might have to answer a quick call. And this is just a little chart kind of showing how many calls we get a year. 2015 was a big year because there was a bunch of unusual mortalities. That's when the mer population crashed. We also had a big die-off of sea otters in Kachemak Bay. But over the past 5 years, things have kind of leveled off to us getting around 400 calls a year. And believe it or not, in 2020, even though there wasn't that much tourism happening in the state, I think because, you know, people living in their towns and villages were out walking about and they called us. And so we still got a very large number of calls about animals people were concerned about or about deceased animals. Most of the calls we get are birds, because there's a lot of birds out there. And then after that, we get a bunch of seal calls. Sea otters vary. I would say a lot of calls we get are about sea otters, but our admins for sea otters are very limited. So that's why that circle graph in the corner there is a little skewed in that. Even though we got probably a couple hundred sea otter calls, we only brought in, had as active cases 6 sea otters. And then the cetaceans, that's usually with dead animal strandings and us helping with the necropsies. So how do we decide whether an animal should be sent to the Sea Life Center? How do we decide if an animal needs help? Well, there's a lot of different things. First of all is the species. As Gay said earlier, if it is an ice seal, we have to take into special consideration that if its animal comes down to us, it's going to need to stay in human care for the rest of its life. That's the same also for sea otter pups and for walrus calves too. In that these animals with the ice seals, it's the agreement with the tribal leaders that ice seals shouldn't go back up to their finding spot. But with walrus and sea otters, especially with the calves, the care that they need is so intense that we're just not able to release them back into the wild because they don't have the same social interactions as they do if they were to stay with mom. Age and size is very important. If we taking in a 5-pound or 10-pound seal pup is very different than us being able to take in a 2,000-pound Steller sea lion bull. Also, the nature of the injury. Is it something that we can really help? As a lot of times we get calls about sea lions or other large animals that are on their rookeries, and you see packing material or fishing gear that they're entangled in. And sometimes just because of their location, and the nature of what's happening and the supply and the equipment that we have available, we might not be able to respond. Also, and these are kind of the fun calls, is to determine whether something is normal versus abnormal. The reason I say that they're fun calls is I love when I get a call from someone and what they describe is actually normal. And I can say, what you're looking at is a really cool thing about nature, and this animal sounds perfectly fine. Let's just leave it where it is. But location is the animal out of its normal area. For example, a few years ago, a bunch of ring seals showed up in Alaska. Granted, they were outside their location, but they, and that was a very big concern that they were so far away from the Arctic. Their activity, are they perky or are they pretty down and out? Body condition, and that's what I'm showing with these two pictures. They're both spotted seals. One you can see is very tiny, is actually next to a flip-flop, looks really, really skinny. The other one is a spotted seal call that we got actually from Nome. It showed up in a miner's dredge, sluice dredge. And here you can see he looks pretty fat and pretty in good coat condition. So needless to say, the one next to the flip-flop, we did bring down to the Sea Life Center for help. But the one that was on the sluice, we just told them to put it in the water. And of course, before we even consider taking an animal out of its area, we let the village know, let the Ice Seal Commission know that this animal's there, and to see if there is an interest for someone to possibly harvest it. I'd say this is more common with our walrus calves, but most of the time, if an animal is pretty sick looking, the last thing anybody wants to eat is eat a sick animal. But sometimes we get calls about animals that look relatively robust, but they're in the wrong area or something like that, and so someone will harvest them. And I think that's kind of what's unusual with us versus other rehab centers in the lower 48, is that we do have a very strong respect for the culture of subsistence harvesting. I mean, it's so important, and it's one of the reasons that we exist is to help monitor the environment, and with the projects that we do to help learn more about the population so that they can continue to be a viable food resource. So we have, I'm going to kind of show one of our animals that came with us, and she's now part of our research program. Her name is Dutch. She was a ring seal that was found like under a bridge in Unalaska, and she didn't look very healthy, and she had dry eyes. She was out of her area. She looked skinny for a ring seal. She was like a 1 or 2 year old seal. And so we decided that the best thing for her was to bring her to the Sea Life Center. And for that, she was packed in a dog kennel and taken on a plane, and then taken on another plane. And then maybe there was a third plane in there too to finally get it to Anchorage. And then we go to Anchorage with our truck and triage the animal and then bring it back to the Sea Life Center. It's very common for us to be working with charter boat captains or bush pilots to try and bring an animal from a remote area, at least to an airport hub so we can get it to Anchorage, and then drive the 2 hours or the 4-hour round trip to bring it back to the Sea Life Center for treatment. So these animals go through a lot of travel before we even see them. Then once they have an animal, our first thing to do is to do an exam and to stabilize them. Especially with the seal pups, they don't drink water. So if they're not getting mama's milk, if they're not eating, they quickly become dehydrated. And if they're not eating, they quickly become emaciated. As you know, especially up in the Arctic, their time with mom is very short. The food they get is very calorie dense, very fatty. So anytime they spend away from not getting that from mom, they can get sick pretty quickly. And in some cases, we might have to do some pretty intense care. That picture on the far right is an animal that had an IV catheter. He was pretty critical, but actually he did survive, and he's part of our research program now. But he's actually the one that was next to that flip-flop. And then the one on the left is Dutch, which is the one that was underneath that bridge. So what do we do when we're doing the intake exam? If the animal is hydrated enough, we'll try to take some blood. And with that, we're looking for infection. Also, all the organs in your body produce chemicals, and by that go into the blood. And by looking at those chemicals in the blood, we can get an idea of how those organs are working. Especially with animals that come to us that are dehydrated and malnourished, we'll see changes in the liver and the kidney values. We'll be looking for pathogens. We'll be looking for diseases. So we'll be taking a lot of cultures. For that, we do like things that we'll put swabs up the nose and up the butt and stuff like that to look for bacteria and viruses. And especially with the unusual mortality event that's still, I think it's still declared for some of the seals, is with the hairless ones, it was especially prevalent a couple of years ago, where these animals were showing up with lesions, open wounds on their skin and hairless areas where they shouldn't be hairless, and with the molt. It was like it was not even molting season, but yet they had hairless areas. We would take skin scrapes and biopsies to try and figure out what's going on with that. We don't necessarily do this all at once, because the last thing we want to do is overstress the animal, because that can be a little bit too much for them. And so sometimes we might do this over a series of days or a week before we get all of the samples that we need. Some of the viral testing we do and some of the bacterial testing we do is distemper, herpes, brucella. These are all diseases that can affect either people, or they can affect animals like dogs and livestock and things like that. And what's also important is throughout the animals stay with us is when we do follow-up blood testing to see how they're progressing, we'll bank that serum for future testing. Unfortunately, not every animal that comes with us makes it. This is actually a necropsy from a seal that came with us. Her name was Noonie. As you can see in that picture in the far right, that she was hairless, and she actually had some lesions on her skin. She had a pretty bad pneumonia from parasites, and and so she didn't make it. And on necropsy, you can actually see the worms that were in her lungs. And learning from her, that really helped us be able to treat the other ring seals that came to us during that season. So like I said before, when an animal comes to us, they're very dehydrated and malnourished because they're not, they can't drink water. And so if they're not eating, they go south pretty quickly. How do we get that food into them quickly? We can do fluids under the skin. What you're seeing here is what we call tube feeding, where we put a tube directly into the stomach. And there we start with a very simple solution of very simple proteins and sugars, electrolytes, and vitamins, for them to start to get some calories and for them to start to get some hydration. When you get an animal that's very dehydrated and malnourished, you don't want to give them a steak. You don't want to give them a hamburger because their gut system has pretty much started to shut down. So you start very slow with very simple things like this electrolyte solution, and then you slowly start to add food into that solution as they start to recover. Some of the things we look for is, wounds, lesions, but other things that we see commonly in our animals is pneumonia. And as everybody knows, parasites are a normal part of the environment, but when you have an animal compromised, those parasites can really take over. So here we have some pictures of Dutch again. Wondering what we did from the animal that died. When Dutch came in, we were very concerned about her having lungworm. She already had parasites coming out of her butt. Those are some tapeworms on that glove there. And so we actually did a CT scan of her lungs. And with that, we could actually see that there were some lesions from lungworms in her that we needed to be concerned about. So to treat her, I'm going to show a movie. We put medicines in a nebulizer. So we gave her antibiotics and anti-inflammatories and things to help break up mucus while she was being treated. And since she was a ring seal, she was going to stay in human care. So we worked with her a lot so that she was comfortable with us. And so we put her in this little tote, and that tote was connected to a nebulizer, very similar to folks who maybe have asthma. And we were able to give medicines into that tote that she would breathe in, and that stuff, then that medicine would then go directly into her lungs. We actually did that for about a month and a half. It was a very long process to not only get her these parasites out of her system, but to give her time for her lungs to recover from the insult. So other things we do for nutrition, again, we do tube feeding, but there are some animals where bottle feeding is the best way to go. For example, this is our one and only bearded seal pup that's come through our center so far. And believe it or not, for her, bottle feeding worked really well. But for the ring seals and the spotted seals, tube feeding is the most efficient way because they are not ones to want to take it to bottle feeding that easily. Once they graduate from bottle feeding, we start weaning them onto fish. And for most seals, they learn how to fish through instinct. So by giving them the opportunity to go after live fish, they learn that fish is good food as well as good enrichment. There we go. She got it. Kind of. Now she has to work on trying to get it down her mouth, but she's not quite there yet. If they, some of the animals take a little bit longer to learn how to eat solids. And so we will, what we call assist feeding, or actually put the food in their mouth. Because sometimes they don't quite get the concept that fish is food. And I'll let you know, happens, there are some ice seals that we've had to do this with, but it's more common with harbor seals that we have to kind of show them that fish is food. Here we go. And then on the left-hand side, for the animals that are going to stay in human care, we continue to interact with them closely so that they associate yummy food with people. And that'll be very helpful in building behaviors when they when they graduate from our program. And of course, graduation. So once the animal is clear of medical issues, they're at a good weight, they're at good demeanor, then they graduate from our program. If it's a harbor seal, we release them back. If it's an ice seal, they might become an ambassador for their species. So here we have a pup that came with us, and this is Siku, who now lives with us. Not lives with us, but Siku is at the Mystic Aquarium with another one of our spotted seals named Nuna. And so they are ambassadors for their species, educating people about ice seals over in Connecticut. But other animals, like I said before, harbor seals we can release, but with the ice seals, they do stay in human care. And now this is where I'm going to segue to Colleen's presentation, because on the right-hand side, a lot of our ice seals have graduated to Colleen's program. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Jane. That was interesting and a perfect, like you said, segue. Perfect. And then Colleen, you can kind of try to set up your slides. Any question, any burning question for Jane while Colleen's working up her slides right off the bat? And we'll take questions more after Colleen when she's finished. But for right now, while she's setting up, any questions for Jane? I know I've got one. So on the hairless seals, what did you guys come up with any findings on that?
Well,
a lot of that going on up here.
There's no smoking gun.
Okay. We'll leave that because it looks like Jane. I'm sorry to cut you, but we can come back to that. But I can see
Jane, we'll
Colleen
totally go back to that.
Yep. Name. Colleen's up and running, and thanks. So take it away, Colleen. So we saw how the seals come in and get ready, and then they go off to you. Some do. You're on mute. You're muted, Colleen.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I do it all the time.
Hi, everybody. Hi. So amazing, Jane. So much fun. And it's always incredible to see what the rehab program can do with the marine mammals, and in particular, the ice seals that come through there. So it's an awesome program. Thanks for that, Jane. So as Jane mentioned, some of the animals that come through the rehabilitation program at the Alaska Sea Life Center graduate and move on to participation in research programs that are really geared at gaining knowledge from these animals that will support their conservation. So that's where I come in, and that's where my team comes in. Some of them are on the phone with us today. Hopefully you can see these slides all right. So what we're doing is called cooperative research with Alaskan ice seals. And cooperative means the seals are are actually part of that program. They're working with us. They're working closely with scientists and students to help us learn about their species and what we can do to conserve and protect them. And to do this work, you know, my background is mostly in behavior biology and sensory biology. To answer the kinds of questions that we are really needing to know about ice seals, I just don't have all of the knowledge I need to do that. We need to work with a lot of different partners. My specialty is really in working with and teaching captive animals how to participate in research. So we need to work with, you know, many people to make that happen. So here are some of the partners that we work with that I have listed on the screen. We've worked a lot up in the Northwest Arctic Borough, University of San Francisco, the University of British Columbia, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. We even work with a collaborator in Arkansas on ice seals, which is kind of fun, and NOAA's Polar Ecosystems Program, and of course the Native Ice Seal Committee of Alaska. So it takes quite a lot of people to make this work happen. Again, the transition that Jane just described to you is how we go from having these animals in kind of rehabilitative care to having them really working very closely with scientists and people in a really a positive manner, and to keep them healthy and safe in captivity so that we can study them and learn from them. And that is really the work that I'm doing and that I'm going to tell you about today. And again, the big picture here is not just rehab to research, but rehab to research to really trying to understand what data gaps that we can fill for seals that live in the wild. You know, what can we do with these few captive animals in our care that we can't learn any other way? So basically, we want to be able to focus on research questions that we can't learn from wild seals and that we can't learn from post-mortem animals or animals that have been collected in the subsistence harvest. We want to kind of focus on things that we can't find out any other way. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about right now. The places where we're doing this work are 2 captive facilities in the United States, the Alaska Sea Life Center, you just heard all about it in Seward, Alaska, and also my home facility at the University of California, Santa Cruz at Long Marine Laboratory, where we have some specialized facilities for working with a whole variety of different marine mammal species. So the nice thing about working between California and Alaska is we get kind of a range of environmental conditions where we can evaluate these animals. We can get them into kind of a subarctic climate where we can study their kind of more natural physiology and health, and we can also study them in a bit of a warmer climate down here in California. But this is a very cold water facility where we're working, and so it's a healthy facility for these ice seals to live, even though it's outdoors. This is it. This is kind of seal school right here. This is kind of the group of animals that I work with that are Alaskan ice seals that are participating or that have participated in this research program. So in captivity, we work with 3 different species: the spotted seals, the ring seals, and the bearded seals. 3 different species with very different life history characteristics and very different ecological niches and habits. So it's really a lot of the work that we do is kind of comparative in nature. We want to understand how these seals are similar to one another within a species, how they're different between these different species, and also how they might be different from seals that live in other parts of the world and that face other types of challenges. So this is like my family group that you're looking at here. We work, the team that I work with and we work really closely with these animals every day. So we spend a lot of time together. I'm just gonna highlight for you, oops, back one, these guys in yellow. All of these seals marked in yellow, think it's 9 of them. They all came to work in the research program following initial stranding and treatment and care in Alaska. All over Alaska, they came from all over Alaska and made their way to the Alaska Sea Life Center, and then made their way eventually into our research program, where we continue to learn about these animals. We just have 2 of these bearded seals down at the bottom that came to us from Kotzebue Sound, just north of your region. So, you know, the bearded seals out of this group are, you know, a really intriguing group of animals. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why we're so interested in learning more about those bearded seals. But this is kind of the squad. This is the research squad. Okay, I know there's a lot of words on this slide, but I just want to tell you, when I first started working with ice seals, it was in 2010. I had the chance to work initially with 2 very young 3-month-old spotted seals that came through the rehabilitation program in Seward. And that began some work that we did on acoustic sensitivity, sound sensitivity, and hearing. It's a kind of a field of science that we call bioacoustics. So that research initially happened at Long Marine Lab. It all happened in California. And we worked first with 2 young spotted seals, followed by 2 young ring seals, followed by 2 young bearded seals that all participated in kind of similar research projects. What we did is we measured their underwater hearing in quiet conditions to see what their optimal acoustic sensitivity was. We measured their hearing above the water surface when they were hauled out in air in a special acoustic chamber, where we could do very fine scale hearing tests with them. We measured their hearing in noisy conditions. We measured it following exposure to different types of human generated noise, like seismic noise, and like high background noise, like from ships. And we looked at how well they could hear, not just like acoustic test tones, but also how well they could hear the sounds of other seals. How well could they detect and hear the sounds of another seal at some distance to them? And right now we're carrying that work forward. We're measuring the sensitivity of these animals to very low frequency noise, the type of noise that can be generated by icebreakers, but also some kinds of seismic oil and gas exploration activities that are scheduled to be happening in polar seas in the future. So we asked a lot of different questions about the way that these animals perceive sound in their environment. Most of you know that the ice seals, but especially the ring seals, are prey animals. So they're very sensitive to acoustic disturbance. I'm going to try playing a video for you just so you can see what that kind of work looks like. This is an underwater hearing test with spotted seal AMAC. This is just to give you an idea of what my lab looks like. That's the Marine Lab in California. We're right on the edge of the ocean in Monterey Bay. And here we have AMAC coming up. He's working with his trainer, Jenna. This is a trained animal who's cooperating in a behavioral hearing test. And if you listen carefully, you hear that little tone, that little whoop, and AMAC responds by touching the target. So this is what we call a behavioral hearing test. Just like when you go to the doctor and raise your hand when you hear a tone, this little seal is going to tell us, yep, I heard it, by touching that target. Each time he gets a correct response, you can see he earns a fish reward. This is a really fun game for AMAC. And every once in a while, he doesn't have a tone. He has to listen and wait, really quiet, and he gets a reward if he doesn't detect a tone. So I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like for us to be working with these trained ice seals. You know, I said we spend time with them every day. We spend a lot of time with these animals, 8 to 10 hours a day, every day, 365 days a year, feeding them, caring for them, and also training them to participate in these kinds of research tasks so we can learn more about what they're capable of. let me just show you a little bit of this one. I told you we also test their hearing and air. We have these specialized research facilities in our lab. This is an acoustic chamber that I think this is Tunu, the spotted seal, is trained to go inside. He's hopping in, he's walking with his trainer, and now he's going to do that same hearing test inside this special sound controlled room. It's extremely quiet in there, so he's listening for very faint tones. Okay, and that little buzzer tells him he's made a correct response. So he's listening, he's waiting for a signal. You see that little whoop signal he gets, and he's touching that target on his side. So that's what it looks like when we do this kind of work. And this research has been really important in trying to determine safe sound exposure levels for seals in the wild. And it has a lot of different kind of environmental applications for human activities and habitats that seals use. In addition to studying how they respond to sound, how well they can hear, we also look at what types of sounds these animals make and how they communicate. So this is one of the first studies of spotted seal sound production to have been done. I don't know if any of you have ever heard a spotted seal, probably not, because they're very quiet in air. But it turns out that underwater during the breeding season, male spotted seals produce a whole set of different social sounds. This is just in the spring, and it's just the males, and it's just the males that are about 4 years old and older who make these kinds of sounds. So you can see this is a Tunu again on the photo, but you know, he and other spotted seals look like they produce at least 8 different types of underwater sounds, and they're all pretty low frequency. They're all less than about 2 kilohertz, but you can see from these voice prints on the screen that they have different acoustic characteristics. Why is this important? One, it's cool that spotted seals make these sounds. They're amazing to listen to and to hear. And the other reason it's important is because if we know what they sound like, we know when they produce sound and what time of year, we can listen using acoustic devices in places where people can't easily get to. We can listen for spotted seals and use that information to, you know, support their conservation by understanding where they are and when. We know what they're doing when they're making these sounds. We know that they are in breeding mode when they do this kind of thing. They just make these sounds only about 2 to 3 months out of the year. Okay, now I told you the story that I got interested in these seals by really looking at their sound production, their hearing, and sort of their acoustic behavior. And while I was doing this work, I had the recurring thought that sound really may not be the biggest issue these animals are facing. It's true that acoustic disturbance is important, but when we see the scope and gravity of what is happening to the climate in polar regions, you know, you can't help but think, oh gosh, you know, what else can we learn about these animals that may support their conservation in the face of climate change? So I convinced a few friends to work on this project with me, and we called it FOCUS. FOCUS means true seals, so it was a good fit for us, but the acronym actually means the physiology and health of cooperating Arctic seals. The idea is we have these highly trained seals that we had started to work with through the hearing studies. We thought, what can we do to learn more about their physiology and health? The first ice seal unusual mortality event in Alaska started in 2011 or 2012, right at the time we were doing this work. And it just seemed so important to us to try to address some of these fundamental questions about, you know, the biology, health, and conservation of these seals with the resources that we had. So this work takes place both at Long Marine Laboratory in California and at the Alaska Sea Life Center. And we work with these, you know, well-trained, very clever spotted, ringed, and bearded seals, and up to 4 individuals per species now. So we've made our sample size a little bit bigger. We convinced NOAA to help support this research through their Alaska Pinnipeds program. We had to enlist a lot of help to make this happen. And NOAA was a big partner in this effort, but also scientists from all around with different types of expertise, and especially veterinarians and animal care specialists that we enlisted in helping us with this work. So again, our big goal was to do collaborative research to advance knowledge of these Alaskan ice seals, and to do research that we could not do with wild or post-mortem animals, because it's hard, it's very expensive, time consuming, and difficult to study seals every day in captivity. So we really wanted to focus on questions that we couldn't answer any other way. And we focused on basic research in health, biology, physiology, and behavior. We opened a big net. We wanted to learn the most important things about these animals, not just the type of things that, you know, I was good at doing or somebody else was good at doing. So we enlisted this team, and we dug deep into this over the last 6 years or so. We're coming on 6 years of doing this work to do basic research in health, biology, nutrition, looking at energy intake, how much these seals eat, their growth and development, their annual molting patterns, trying to understand their metabolism, their dive capacities, their physiological abilities like their breathing and heart rate patterns, and thermoregulation, and other aspects of their biology. That's a lot. That's a pretty ambitious list. But we have made a lot of progress on this. And what I want to do for the rest of this talk is just highlight for you some of the different projects we've done and what we've learned. So first off, because the unusual mortality event was going on in Alaska and seals were turning up, looking kind of sickly, some hair loss, you know, some lesions on the body. And many of you in the Bering Strait region may remember this. You know, we really had no idea what was going on with these animals. And one of the biggest problems was that we had very little data on the health and biology of normal seals, of normal healthy seals. So when these sick seals started rolling in, we didn't really have a good basis of comparison to try to understand what was going wrong. So the first goal of our project was to say, hey, we've got a bunch of healthy animals here. What can we learn about them? And, you know, how can we use that information and apply it to these stranded animals, and also these animals that were showing up dead on shore in Alaska. So we took this group, all the data we could find, all the data that we had of these captive animals, and we collected more and added more to it. And then we got a partner, which was NOAA's Polar Ecosystems Program. Some of you might know Peter Bovang, Mike Cameron, and their team. They had been sampling wild seals, and they had a bunch of samples in their archives. And we put all of this information together to try to learn about the health and biology of normal, healthy ice seals. There was not much known about this. And we published a paper, I don't know, 2 years ago, looking at comparative health assessments of these Alaskan seals. And in that paper, we described what their normal kind of blood chemistry, blood counts, parasite loads, pathogen exposures, and disease exposures, what those looked like at a population level in animals that were presumably normal, that didn't have any kind of indices for poor health. And so that work is now available. That's helping us a lot in dealing with the current UME, or the one that peaked last year, in trying to understand what is affecting the health of these animals in the Arctic ecosystem. And for the first time, ice seals are now represented in kind of the handbook of marine mammals. They've never been included in that before. But now we have data and knowledge that we can share with veterinarians and scientists all around the world about these animals. So that was one of our big goals, and we were able to accomplish that. And along the lines of what Jane was talking about, we realized that there was a lot of diagnostic data from ice seals that were in veterinary care during rehabilitation that we might be able to learn from. One of the small questions that we were interested in answering is how different species of Alaskan ice seals, how adapted they are for diving and how their bodies are adapted for carrying oxygen. And you may know that seals carry oxygen stores just like humans do in 3 compartments: in their blood, in their muscle, and in their lungs. That's where we carry our oxygen stores, and same's true for seals. So we wanted to know more about how seals carry oxygen in their lungs and how their lungs work. Everything we know about this really comes from studies of deceased seals that have been sampled and had their lungs removed and looked at. But we really wanted to know, what did the lungs of living seals look like? And Jane and her friends down the hall were collecting information from the seals they were rehabilitating by getting these scans of their full bodies and their lungs to make sure that they were healthy and they didn't have parasites and parasites in their lungs and damage from those parasites in their lungs. So this was a cool project. We wanted to look at the inside of living seals to learn more about their biology. And you can see over there that actually might even be Dutch inside the CT scanner gathering these data. And by taking all the images from these scans and putting it together into 3-dimensional models, we actually were able to look at the lungs of ring seals inside of living bodies. Here you see the respiratory tract of a real ring seal. This is a small animal that's only 25 centimeters across the bottom. It's about this big on the scale. So this animal, you know, you could actually pick her up and carry her. But now we can see what those lungs look like, and also how that compares to what their lungs look like out of the body. Not surprisingly, the lungs inside the body are different than they are outside of the body. We were able to get more accurate measurements of what their full size is when they're inflated, and also when they have exhaled and the lungs are relaxed. Just an example of how we can use veterinary data to improve our scientific knowledge of the species. So again, this is a bearded seal that came through the rehabilitation program. This is the first living stranded bearded seal that I know of in Alaska, you know, in at least 30 years. And this animal came from your region. Shaktoolik, near Shaktoolik is where this animal came from. We named her in honor of that place. Her name is Shaktoolik, and Tulik for short. She was rehabilitated at the Alaska Sea Life Center in 2019. And then we actually moved her to Santa Cruz. And this is her on the right, healthy and growing in our research facility there. And she's now involved in a bunch of different research projects. So she's made that transition. How do we get from a rehab, kind of a wild seal, to a seal that will really help us in our research by behaving just like AMAC and Tunu, the seals that you saw earlier? So we teach them to participate in various kinds of research using positive reinforcement. Fish is a very good motivator for these seals, and different positive training techniques. And then once we've trained them to work with us, we are able to collect kind of routine measurements of various things: food consumption, body mass, body size, blubber thickness. You can see that's research technician Maddie Miranda up in Alaska at the Sea Life Center, measuring the kind of blubber thickness on this seal that she's sitting with. We look at their coat condition. We even measure the length and condition of their whiskers, and we really assess their behavior constantly. And we take lots and lots of data from these animals, and then we can use it to answer different types of questions. you know, you heard about little ring seal Dutch, that little skinny seal that was smaller than, or just a little bit bigger than a flip-flop. This is what she looks like in the winter in Alaska. So her body condition has really improved. But we also know that it changes a lot over the year. You know, the condition of the seals really changes throughout the year. That's one of the things we're interested in looking at. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about a couple of different projects to give you a taste for what we can learn from these seals while they're in our care. You may have heard that as seals grow, their whiskers also grow. And depending on what they're eating, their whiskers kind of encode a dietary record. I mean, it gives us an idea of being able to look back in time to see where seals have been and what they've been eating. Super interesting. So we can learn a lot from seal whiskers, and we can collect whiskers from wild seals to learn about where they've been. However, you need some information to interpret those studies. You need to know how long of a period of time is encoded in a whisker, and how fast those whiskers grow, and how long they stay on the animal. You know, is it a 10-year record, or is it a 1-week record? Is it a 1-month record? You know, we need to learn more about how to read the dietary information that's encoded in a whisker as it grows from its base. As it grows, as it grows, as it grows, it leaves a record behind of what the seal was doing at that time. So we did this. We did these studies with, at least we did them with ringed seals, spotted seals, and bearded seals. Just by looking at these seals, you can see their whiskers look really different from each other. And what did we learn? We learned that spotted and ringed seals lose at least half their whiskers during the spring molt. You know, you may have seen some seals in the spring that have really short muzzle. But they regrow them really quickly, 1 to 2 millimeters a day. That's about 10 times faster than your fingernails grow. Kind of amazing. And you know, those whiskers, because they grow so quickly and then they stop growing, we learned that the whole whisker, that long whisker, really only encodes a few months of data. You know, the seals molt in the spring, the whiskers grow quickly, really quickly over a period of like 40 to maybe 90 days. And then they stop growing. So even if the seal's swimming around all winter and we collect a whisker the following year, the information that's contained in that whisker only gives us about, 40 to 90 days worth of data. Bearded seals, on the other hand, you may know they have these beautiful, long, smooth whiskers, different from the whiskers of ringed and spotted seals. They are much, they have different growth characteristics. So those whiskers, they start off growing quickly, but then they slow down and they just keep growing longer and longer and longer. In the wild, the bearded seals will rub them down, they'll wear them shorter. In captivity, they sometimes can grow very long, but they can encode a really long record that lasts for multiple years. So from a bearded seal whisker, we can learn quite a lot about where they've been, what they've eaten, and what they've been doing. So with this captive data, we can then use it to learn more about samples that we get from wild seals. Really cool. Okay, basic question. How much does a seal eat? You know, this is a really important question when we think about their energy budgets and what they need to survive in the wild. So what you see on this slide is kind of the relationship between food intake, how many calories a day a seal eats, and its body condition over a 1-year period. So these data are for a spotted seal, one spotted seal over 1 year. And the bars on the plot represent the number of calories per month that seal consumes. So we can see it eats the most in end of summer, late summer, it's eating its most, and the least in kind of early spring. That seal is eating maybe twice as much in late summer as it is in early spring. And so we can also look at what happens to that animal's body condition. So the dots you see on this plot, they go with the axis on the right. They show us the percent blubber mass for this animal. and how it changes over the year. So in terms of their body condition, we find out that the seals are really in their prime condition in wintertime. That's not when they're eating the most, but that's when they're at their fattest. And not surprisingly, they're at their leanest just after that molting period in late spring, early summer. They reach a low in their body condition, and their body condition changes widely. It goes from 20% at its minimum, 20% blubber, all the way up to, you know, for a spotted seal, 40% blubber, and for a ring seal, more than 50% blubber. That's one of the highest body fat contents, you know, that we know of. So measuring these things really helps us figure out more about their annual cycle and their energy budgets, and how that relates to important events like the molt. So if you look at this bar on the bottom down here, this is just tells us when is this seal molting. So this year, this seal molted from mid-May to kind of late June. Spotted seals take about 36 days to start and then finish their molt. And that molting period really corresponds to a minimum in their body condition. Again, not surprisingly, but when they're molting, that's normally when we see them. So we're really seeing them at their poorest body condition. At least that's when scientists are looking at these animals. So that's helpful for us to know what these seals are looking like times of the year when we can't see them in the wild. You know, I mentioned we watch these animals all the time, and we measure their behavior in different ways. If we compare that data that we just looked at on energy intake and body fat to other data about how much time seals spend in and out of the water all throughout the year, we can see, of course, that seals haul out the most, where the peak in this plot is, during the annual molt. Again, they have a big spike in their haul out behavior. At the peak of their molt, they're spending, 65, 70% of their time out of the water trying to grow that new coat. And the rest of the year, much less, 10 to 20% or less of their time hauled out. So this is really helpful data to look at too. We're really interested in this molting cycle. We think that that is the period when seals are most vulnerable. Okay, one other really interesting metric, physiological metric that we can get from these trained animals is measuring their metabolism or their metabolic rate. That's kind of the other side of the equation from energy intake. This is how much energy does it cost them to do different things at different times of the year. I mean, these are little carnivores wrapped up in a lot of blubber, living in a very cold environment. It's very interesting for us to know about, how much energy they have to burn to survive in that environment. And so by working with some amazing physiologists, I think we have at least a couple of them on this call, including Nicole Tometz at the University of San Francisco, we've been able to make measurements of the metabolism of these animals. What we do is we condition the seals to rest for a long interval under what we call a metabolic dome. So they can swim in and out, but they can earn a fish reward if they swim in and stay in for a long period of time, usually 10 to 15 minutes. They need to get in there and they need to relax calmly while these measurements are being made. If they do that, they can earn a big fish reward. So we gradually increase the amount of time they spend under there until we can make these measurements reliably. Then we use a whole series of equipment to try to extract information about how much oxygen they're burning while they're resting under that metabolic dome. And we do this pretty much every day, all year round. We practice this behavior every day with the seals, and then we make measurements usually at least once a week. And we are able to look at the pattern, how their metabolism changes over the year. So here's what some of that data looks like. On the right, you can see spotted seal over here. This looks like Kunik. He's resting under that metabolic dome. He needs to come in and be really relaxed, and Kunik is great at this. He gets in there, he closes his eyes, he relaxes his shoulders, and he shows us that he's super calm. This is like his morning yoga session that he does, and after that, he eats a big breakfast. You can see he's not constrained. He can swim in and out of there if he wants to, but he has learned to go under there each morning before breakfast. Now what we can do is look at the same data we saw earlier. The bars on this graph show his energy intake, how many calories a day he's eating. The bar below it shows when he's molting. And the dots on this plot tell us what his metabolic rate is. How much energy is he burning throughout the year? And it's real clear. We see that there's a real peak in his energy expenditure right during the period of time when he's molting. So it tells us that it takes a lot of energies for seals to complete that annual molt. And that's a really sensitive time of the year for them. And right after burning all that energy during the molt, that is really when their food intake has to pick up. They really need to eat a lot following that period of molt. So that is when they are packing on the calories. And this is a captive seal. You know, he's got fish available to him. It tells us that wild seals are having to eat aggressively during this period as well. So summertime is a really important period for these animals to make up for those energy losses. Okay, I hope you guys are able to follow that. You know, spotted and ring seals are pretty similar in the way that they molt, but we've been super, super interested in these mysterious bearded seals. And almost everything we know about these animals in terms of their molt comes from subsistence hunters. So that information has been incredibly useful in trying to understand their molt. During the unusual mortality event, we wondered, you know, is it normal to see these bearded seals with patchy hair loss, other kinds of issues going on in the winter and spring? We don't really know that much about how bearded seals molt. I told you that a spotted seal takes about 34 days or so, 35 days to grow a new coat, to lose all its old fur, regenerate its skin and epidermis, the upper layer of the epidermis, and generate a new hair coat. We don't really know that for bearded seals. You can see that we just see them at distance. And this seal in the image, he's got some patchy hair loss on him, but we don't really know much beyond that about the molt of bearded seals. So we really wanted to find out more about that. And of course, with these seals in our care, looking at them every day, we're able to study that up close and personal. Again, this is Shek Tulik, the bearded seal, who's helping us learn about this physiological process. Now, if we look at the haul out behavior of a captive bearded seal, it gives us some clues. It tells us that these guys really spend a lot of time hauling out in the spring, and then they go back to normal behavior, and then they start hauling out again. There's kind of a second haul out peak in early summer. What is amazing to know, though, is that bearded seals don't seem to molt kind of all at once the way the spotted seals and the ring seals do. They molt pretty quickly. Ring seals maybe 28 days to spotted seals maybe 34 days to generate an entire new coat. Bearded seals seem to start that process a lot earlier, and their molting period is low and slow and long, and it may take them over 100 days from when they start losing fur to when they fully grow in that new coat. So that was a really interesting discovery that we made, and it helps us interpret also about what wild bearded seals are doing, because of course, when we see them in the wild, we're just looking across all the animals, how many bearded seals are molting at a time. But we don't know how long does it take one bearded seal to start his molt and go all the way to the end. But that's something we can study here. Even though they start losing that coat, around Christmas time or in early January, they really don't change their haul out behavior that much until that new coat is really coming in. So that was really interesting to learn. We also learned, again, that they don't drop all those whiskers during the molting period. They hang on to them for multiple years. If we look at their metabolism, again, this is the energy intake of a young bearded seal in the bars and the metabolism of that seal measured over time. We don't see that big peak in energy expenditure during the molt. So unlike the other animals where their metabolism doubles or even triples during the molting process, bearded seals seem to go, they keep it, everything is extended. The molt lasts longer, the energy expenditure is spread out over a longer period of time. And we see a very different pattern in those animals. Bearded seals are really different from ringed and spotted seals in terms of their evolution. They have been separated in evolutionary time for about 15 million years. So they're very different animals. And I have heard this from subsistence hunters that they taste very different, that they behave, very differently. And of course, we know that they feed very differently, eating off the bottom instead of catching live fish. And all of that kind of goes along with these measurements of their health and physiology. Just one last study that I wanted to tell you about that we have been working on is looking at kind of the natural physiological response of these seals. We call it a cardiorespiratory response. How does their heartbeat and their breathing rate, how do those things interact? So if I ask you, how is your breathing rate? How is your heart rate? You might say, well, my heart rate is pretty steady. It's about 80 beats per minute, maybe, unless I'm exercising. And then I just breathe in and out all the time. I breathe in and out constantly. Well, seals don't do that. They're breathing. Of course, when they're diving, they're holding their breath and they come to the surface and they take a bunch of breaths. I think that's pretty clear. But it turns out when they're resting on land, most seals do the same thing. They hold their breath for long periods of time, and then they take a few breaths and then they go back to holding their breath. So it's kind of like they're diving on land. They're diving without going underwater. They're alternating between these cycles of breathing and breath holding, whether they're swimming and diving or whether they're out of the water. It's really interesting. So what you can see on the slide here is heart rate and breathing rate data for a spotted seal. Over here, we have a spotted seal. This might be Sura or Kunik, maybe 3 or 4 year old spotted seal that's trained at the Alaska Sea Life Center. And this is a non-invasive measurement. So this animal comes up out of the water. We ask them to come up and lay quietly on this surface. And the surface has like a recording electrode on it that is able to pick up the animal's heartbeat. And you can see over here on the screen, if you look carefully, you see a heartbeat that is measuring. So this seal is just sitting there relaxing for a few minutes, waiting for a snack while its heart rate is being measured. And then there's a camera positioned in front of the animal that is measuring when, that we are able to use to measure when each breath occurs. So what that data looks like over here on the plot is really interesting. The red dots here are this spotted seal's heart rate data. And so rather than having a steady heartbeat like we would have, 80 beats per minute, pretty steady unless we're exercising, this seal is kind of jumping up and down between 2 different states. Slow heart rate of about 50 beats per minute, maybe 45 to 50 beats per minute, and a high heart rate of like 120, 130 beats per minute. And he's just going back and forth, slow heart rate, high heart rate, slow heart rate, high heart rate, slow heart rate. He's just going back and forth, even though he's just relaxing and he's not exercising. If we look at what he's doing with his breathing rate, that's these little tick marks at the bottom. So he takes 2 breaths and then he waits about a minute. He takes 1 breath and then he waits 25 seconds. He takes 4 more. Then he waits another 1.5 minutes and he takes 4 breaths, and then he waits another 1.5 minutes and he takes a breath. What we can say is that seal is breathing intermittently. So every once in a while he takes a few breaths, and the rest of the time it's as if he's diving, he's holding his breath. And each time he breathes, his heart rate jumps up 130 beats per minute. And then when he takes that breath hold, boom, it drops way down here as low as 25, 30 beats per minute sometimes. So it just alternates high heart rate when he's breathing, low heart rate when he's breath holding. And he just goes back and forth between those states his whole life. That's what spotted seals do. And it's really interesting to look at how low does it go? How high does it go? You know, what happens when the seal is diving? His heart rate goes even lower. It can drop even, twice as low as this, down to, 10, 20 beats per minute when he has to hold his breath for a long dive. But it's a really interesting pattern to look at. If we compare those data for a spotted seal to the same data for a bearded seal over here, it's pretty different. The biggest difference is if we look at their breathing rate down here with the tick marks. Bearded seals kind of just keep breathing all the time. They don't really hold their breath and dive when they're hauled out of the water. They don't hold their breath for minutes at a time. They just kind of keep breathing all the time. So you might think their heart rate would be pretty steady. We thought their heart rate might be pretty steady. We knew on average it was about 70, 80 beats per minute. But when we linked their heart rate data to their breathing data, we actually could see the heart rate, even though they're breathing pretty steady, the heart rate still jumps up and down from about 100 beats per minute when it's going fast to about 50, 60 beats per minute when it's going slow. So we see that the biology of bearded seals is really different from other seals. They don't have these long breath hold intervals when they're on land. And even when they're diving and foraging, they don't hold their breath for very long periods of time. So this tells us a little bit more about, how we can use a heart rate data and respiratory data, examine their health, but it also tells us a little bit about how their biology can be quite different. Their heart rate never gets up higher than 100, like a spotted seal. So these are kind of lower, slower animals overall. Less extremes, high and low. Last slide I threw in here just says we are working on real world problems. We are trying to work on real world problems. What can we learn from our seals that will help us, to the extent possible, understand how these animals are going to respond to a changing environment, changing food supply. Could be for the better, it could be for the worse, depending on which species and where it's located. So, I told you about how we measure metabolism when seals are resting in the water. We can use a similar setup over here on the right to measure metabolism when seals are resting out of the water. That gives us a chance to compare how they spend energy when they're in the water, when they're out, and how they might be affected if they don't have ice to haul out on, or if they have to swim further to get to a place to haul out, and how that might affect them when they're molting or at other times of the year. It's kind of a paradigm that can really help us build energy budgets for these animals. Then we can also ask the animals to do things like exercise, dive and swim for 20 minutes before you come into the dome, so we can see kind of what that extra cost of exercising and holding your breath and foraging underwater is. What if you have to swim 10 times further to get to a place to haul out, and then you have to go back to get to the place where your food is? How is that going to affect a seal's energy budget? So you can imagine that data like this, plus that information about body condition and how it changes, plus the information about behavior and what happens over the year, we can put all of that information together. Experts that we're working with can put that information together to really try to predict how these animals will respond to changing conditions in the natural environment. And that's really our hope. I mentioned that ice seals are particularly hard to study in the wild. You can see them sometimes, but you don't know if you're seeing the same animal over and over. You can put tags on them, but you're not likely to ever get them back. And you can sample them, after they have died and learn a lot about them. But by studying individual animals every day throughout their lives as they go through each year, each annual cycle, and each developmental stage as they move from a pup to a juvenile to an adult, gives us more clues about the unique biology and the unique behavior and the unique challenges that these animals face in the wild, and how they may respond to a changing Arctic, including really large differences in the amount of sea ice available and when it's available. They are marine mammals, but they're amphibious, and they really depend on having the ability to haul out of the water, especially at certain times of the year. So our hope is to translate those data from all of the different research projects we do, the ones I've told you about today, the other ones that we have going on, some that are just existing up here for now, but we're always trying to think about what we can learn that will really help us make a contribution, so that the people who use these animals for food, the people who use them as a natural resource, and that the people who are responsible for managing them can keep these stocks as healthy as possible, and to try to protect this resource for the future. That's all I have for you guys about the research program. I really just kind of skimmed the surface to give you some idea about how we do this work. This is where you can learn more. See these websites, reach out to Gay, or reach out to me, or reach out to Jane, and we can talk to you about what we know, or we would love to hear even better about what you know about these animals and what you're seeing in your region. That is super, super important information. So that's it. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. And I don't know if you want to leave your screen on, or if you want to take your slides off.
Yeah, sure.
And thanks to the audience for sticking in. This one a little bit longer, but nobody left. So Colleen, Colleen and Jane, you had a captive audience. Really, that's terrific, fantastic picture you both gave from the rehab side of the house to where we are with what some of our essential wildlife in our region are, how they're helping to kind of get a grip on really establishing some basic biology on the animals themselves. So that's pretty exciting for us, and how that could be used to sort of come back at us when we're experiencing what we're experiencing up here. So thanks heaps.
Oh, there it is.
And hopefully we will get you back, because I think if that's just scratching the surface, there's a lot going on. We had Mike Cameron, if people were on, I think a week or two ago, we had Mike Cameron and Peter Bovang, and they gave some presentation on how they're going to use the seals that probably came from Jane and are now with Colleen to look at growth and fat layers, so using the drones, taking pictures.
Yeah, that's right. That's actually our next project, because we have these good body condition measurements for our animals. We make them every week, and they change throughout the year. So we're going to see how well those drone images, how well that matches up with the reality of the animal's body condition.
So let me open it up to questions. And to tell you the truth, there has been a caller since the get-go, and callers get priority, because that means tonight they've been doing it without any presentation and without any visuals. So they've been listening and following along throughout the whole talk. So the caller, I don't know if you have any questions, but if you do, the way to do this would be to unmute yourself and then ask your question. Or you could use the chat function and write in a chat, like a little text that way. So does the caller have any questions? Because it is tough being the caller. All right. But if they jump in, I'm going to stop for them, because it is tough to have a caller and not be noticed. You can't raise your hand. With that, the other thing, any questions first off? A burning question.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions.
All right, and before you start with your questions, for the rest of you, then show Jane and Colleen a little love in the chat box. It's a thing to be, and Colleen is on a different time zone, So I don't know what time it is, Colleen, for you, but it's not our time, and it's got to be later at night. So show some love there. If you enjoyed the presentation, oh, getting all the claps. These are pros. These are Zoom pros right here. But comments are always welcome for Colleen and Jane, because they did a great job, and it's tough to be the speaker, right? Always nice to listen, but tough when you have to give the presentation. So with that, while everyone's doing that, Marilyn, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the presentation. It was really, really interesting. I have two questions. One is that, how do you think that the caloric input that you measure in your captive animals compares to a wild animal? So that's one question. The other has to do with the haul out times that you record for your animals. You know, you said that you guys spend a whole lot of time with them. You know,
Yeah.
they're doing tests, you're feeding them, you're interacting with them. So how do you judge their haul out time compared to a wild animal?
Yeah, those are both awesome questions. And Nicole Tometz is also on the call. She's my research partner at the University of San Francisco, who's a physiologist that I work with. But we have talked about this a lot. Like in captivity, what we do with the seals is we allow their diet every day to vary throughout the whole year. We try to feed the animals as much as they're really motivated to eat, not more and kind of not less than that. So we assess their behavior every day, and we adjust their food so that they are really kind of consistently, you know, eating what they want each day without overeating or undereating. And then when we do that, we find these very regular patterns of increased intake and decreased intake throughout the year. But they're living in captivity, right? They're not swimming long distances. They are swimming around their pools, but they don't have all the same energetic tasks. They're not diving deep that wild seals have to do. So what we do is we assume that our measurements are a conservative estimate of how much a seal is eating during the year. So we think it will be that much or more. But the changes throughout the year, like if their food intake doubles or even triples seasonally, we think that those relative patterns are likely to be the same for the wild individuals. You know, they have certain times of the year where their energetic demands are just higher. So we make some assumptions. We know these are conservative estimates about the number of calories, and physiologists like Nicole and other people on our team, they can also find ways of estimating maybe what a correction factor might be to a wild seal. But we know they're taking in at least that many calories, and that it's probably changing in a similar way over the year. The other question that you had was about their haul out behavior. You know, we work with them a lot all day, and, you know, we can interrupt their natural haul out cycles. So the logic there is also pretty similar. They can haul out to rest. You know, they're not able to feed at night like a wild seal can. They only eat during the daytime hours. So we know that affects the pattern that we're measuring, but because we measure it the same way every day, all year round, the relative changes in that behavior are likely to be very consistent. So when we see a bearded seal go from spending 5% of its time hauled out to spending 70% of its day hauled out, that's a pretty big difference. You know, if it has that big change in haul out behavior associated with, you know, regenerating the new coat. And what's cool is that some of the biologists that are working in your area and north of you, including the Alaska Fish and Game crew and the North Slope Burrow crew, they've put these little sensors out on their wild seals where they can measure what proportion of time wild seals are spending in and out of the water. And so we can compare that to what our captive seals are doing. And it is really very similar patterns of time. It's amazing that animals like bearded seals, much of the year, they really don't spend that much time out of the water. What we gain by measuring this with captive animals instead of just wild animals is we can line up the haul out data with these other factors about eating, about metabolism, about coat condition. We can kind of get all this information at once. It's really hard to kind of put that data together for wild seals. So I hope that answers your question, Marilyn. Those are big issues for us.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I guess if I could slip a final one in, do you give your bearded seals invertebrates or fish?
It's a really good question. For the most part, we actually give them fish. Wild bearded seals do eat fish. It's part of their diet. We supplement them with some squid and some cephalopods, and we offer them shrimp sometimes, but when they're in captivity, they really tend to prefer fish. They take their calories that way. So the diet is not totally representative, but the number of calories that they're consuming is equated. Good question. You're muted, Kate.
Always muted. I know. I just like do it to myself. So thank you. And any other questions for Colleen or Jane?
This is Charlie, if I could jump in.
Go ahead, Charlie. Good to hear you.
Yep. Yeah. No, I very much enjoyed both your presentations. I learned a lot about seals. I'm usually a fish biologist and spent a lot of time in the air looking at herring in the spring times.
Ah, interesting.
And also crab research on the ice and stuff. And I've had lots of fun experiences with seals, surprising them and watching them try to get away from me. And sometimes it's just funny. I mean, I don't intentionally go out to do that, but it happens. But my impression of bearded seal is that they're in the springtime, they wait for the herring. I'm very keyed in on herring myself. You'll see them.
Love herring.
You'll see them on the shore fast ice that's starting to break before the herring arrive here in Norton Sound. And there'll be a long lead, just a couple feet wide, and there'll be bearded seal at regular intervals, all not looking at each other. Everyone is facing away from everybody else, like every 100 feet.
Wow.
And then once the herring arrive, it's not uncommon to see this bearded seal in particular just covered in herring eggs because they've been down there feeding amongst the spawning herring.
And they get them stuck in their whiskers.
Yeah, and they're all of their whole neck and everything. I mean, they're just encrusted. And
wow.
And I assume they're eating the recently spawned herring on the seaweed, but I don't know that. I just think that. But that's a real high calorie food.
Of course.
And it's and they do eat herring. All those seals eat herring and salmon. Yep.
Boy.
Anyway, thank you.
Charlie, I'd love to see some pictures of that kind of setup. How deep is the water there, you think? I mean, you're in Norton Sound.
So where the herring are, it's pretty shallow.
Yeah.
So 40 feet in the deep and 20 feet in a lot of places.
Yeah. Super interesting. I would love to see that.
Yep.
So
Anyway,
thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.
Cool observation.
Quick fun fact about bearded seals, they can tell the difference between a gravid herring and a regular herring fish. So they can immediately taste if there's roe in the fish or not. And sometimes prefer it, sometimes, we'll spit it out, but they can definitely tell the difference.
Colleen, it's great. I think we should get you back here. Just so you know, I don't know when you're talking to the Ice Seal Committee up north, that doesn't really get at that sort of regional representation. It's very few people. And here you kind of can get, I just think it's really great. You brought some news back, and you too, Jane, you're kind of the first to bring it back at our regional level. And the Bering Strait is certainly all about the seals down here because we're utilizing all 4 species.
Amazing.
Yeah, so thank you so much for given us both sides of what happens, because it's really helpful for us. And like I say, this is the first time we're really hearing about this. So, any other questions for Colleen or Jane?
Yeah, Gay, this is Dan. I have a quick question for Jane, if she's still available.
She is right there. Go for it.
I was just curious, given her experience in rehabilitation, if there is one particular species of seal that's more difficult to rehab than others.
That's a good question. In my opinion, I kind of think it was the bearded seal, because maybe we've just had one. So there was definitely a lot of trial and error with that little girl. One of the things we learned with her is that her caloric requirements required her own diet. We ended up using a combination of harbor seal formula recipe and a walrus recipe to make something that worked for her. In some ways, I'd say the easiest is a harbor seal. They're pretty straightforward, and we get so many that we kind of have our system down to a T, give or take the medical mysteries they throw at us every once in a while. I'd say another difficult animal, but which is also a fun animal, is a sea otter, because they are so freaking smart and they are so curious and they are so good at getting themselves into trouble. You definitely have to be on your toes. It's like watching a little toddler, because if you blink, they'll be getting themselves into trouble one way or the other.
All right.
Great, thank you.
And I was going to ask for Jane, when you get ice seals from this region or anywhere else in northern and western Alaska, what is the most common problem? Is there a common problem that when seals are sent in, is there like a common, like, oh, it's going to probably be this?
I would say it depends on their age. When we get the pups, it's definitely maternal neglect. They got separated from mom, or mom rejected them for some reason. So dealing with their dehydration and malnutrition and the medical problems that come from that, being the liver problems, the kidney problems, that's something we see with those guys. But then when we got that influx of older ring seals coming from Unalaska, they all had parasite problems. I think they weren't finding the right food, and thus the parasites were just taking over. And from that, we then had the complications of pneumonia and trying to get the parasites under control without overwhelming the seal during the healing process.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask one more, but anybody else before we shut her down? I'm old enough that when I first saw my first captive seal, it was Hoover at the Boston Aquarium. I'm originally from Rhode Island. The Boston Aquarium in Boston. And I did not know, it was late at night and they had Hoover outside in a big pool with a bunch of other seals. This is a harbor seal that could speak English. Have you ever had any kind of unexpected, and someday I'll tell you that story because
I'm dying to hear it.
well, anyway, I won't get into the details, but it surprised me when the seal swam up to me late at night. I'm with some friends, and we'd been enjoying Boston downtown. I was much younger, and he asked me how I was doing in English with a Boston accent. And, you know, it took a little minute to sort of, I felt like saying, I'm fine, thanks, you know, but it was unusual. So he had a couple things to tell us, which was interesting to hear an animal speak perfect English with a Boston accent. Was unusual. Is there any kind of thing that these seals have in captivity have been unexpected? You know, not that they have to say anything, but unexpected. That particular seal, I guess, he did that himself. He wasn't trained to speak in English, and he picked up phrases, and he was cracking himself up because he had a great laugh too. And but in your experience, has any of these things like that happened for either of you since you're dealing with captives? Sort of like what's the most unusual, unexpected outcome?
Oh gosh, I have to think about this. I don't know. There have been a lot of surprises for us. my team, you know, having Alaskan ice seals in California, that was a big mystery. Like, is this going to work? How will these animals do? We had to have a lot of backup plans. We had to think about how we were going to get the animals from Alaska to California, you know, safely,
Right.
and then how we were going to care for them, you know, once we got there. So I guess one of the things that surprises me is that they have, you know, they really are thriving kind of out of their range in that area. Our water temperatures are pretty cold. They run from like 9 to 17 degrees Celsius. We're near some very deep water, so we have a relatively cold water facility, but certainly not as cold as regular Arctic and subarctic conditions. But the animals have done really well there, which makes me kind of wonder why they haven't been able to move further south in their range. And it seems to be that that dependence on sea ice is just so critical. It really locks the animals into the locations where they need to be. I guess that's what pops to my mind. I'm very familiar with Hoover's story, and I have never had a talking seal, although I have trained a lot of seals to produce sounds. None of them have ever given me any English words, but that's amazing. You know, bearded seals produce these incredible underwater songs when they reach full maturity. So our male is now 6 years old. This is the year we expect him to start singing. And, you know, we can't wait. He's starting to produce some sounds. And so we're waiting to see what his sound production is going to be like.